Hotel manager denies room to black family, turns out father is the building's new owner. "I'm sorry, but we seem to be fully booked tonight," the hotel manager said with a practiced smile that never reached his eyes. Marcus Johnson watched his children's excitement fade as the manager's gaze deliberately avoided the platinum loyalty card in Marcus's hand. Through the lobby windows, 3 white families were being cheerfully checked in by other staff. What the manager didn't know was that the deed to this entire luxury hotel chain had been signed over to Marcus just yesterday. The $300 million acquisition wasn't public yet, but it would be, right after this impromptu inspection revealed exactly how his new investment treated its guests. Some lessons in hospitality were about to be delivered, and Marcus Johnson was going to teach them personally. Marcus Johnson adjusted his watch, a simple titanium Movado that had been a gift from his late father, as the private jet began its descent into Chicago. Through the window, the city's skyline glittered like a constellation against the evening sky. At 42, Marcus had built Johnson Holdings from a small real estate investment firm into a billion-dollar enterprise with properties spanning 3 continents. Today marked his most significant acquisition yet, the prestigious Meridian Hotel Group. "Dad, how long are we staying in Chicago?" asked Zoe, his 13-year-old daughter, not looking up from her tablet where she was finishing a school assignment. "Just 2 nights, sweetheart," Marcus replied. "I need to check on our newest investment before we head back home for your science fair." His son Elijah, 15 and already showing interest in the family business, looked up from his book. "Is this the hotel chain you've been negotiating for since last summer?" Marcus nodded, pride evident in his expression. 6 months of negotiations, and we finally closed the deal yesterday. 34 luxury properties across the country. He didn't mention the resistance from certain board members who questioned whether a black-owned company should be the face of such a prestigious hospitality brand. The $300 million deal had silenced those concerns, money, as always, being the universal language everyone understood. His assistant, Vanessa, handed him a folder with the latest performance reports for the Chicago flagship location. "The numbers look good, but there have been some concerning customer reviews about inconsistent service," she noted. Marcus frowned as he flipped through the pages. "That's why I wanted to visit unannounced. Sometimes the best way to evaluate service is to experience it as a regular guest." The decision to bring his children along had been spontaneous. After the intense negotiations and a final signing, he promised them some quality time. Zoe and Elijah's mother had passed away 5 years ago from breast cancer, and since then, Marcus had made a conscious effort to balance his growing empire with being present for his children. "We're landing in 10 minutes, the pilot announced over the intercom. Marcus put away the reports and sent a quick text to his COO, confirming their meeting for tomorrow afternoon after his initial inspection of the property. No one at the hotel knew the new owner would be checking in tonight. The acquisition wouldn't be announced publicly until next week, after Marcus had visited 3 of the flagship properties. The plane touched down smoothly at O'Hare, and within 30 minutes, their driver was navigating through Chicago's evening traffic toward the downtown Meridian Grand. "This one is supposed to be their crown jewel," Marcus explained as they approached the gleaming glass tower. The 40-story building dominated its corner of Michigan Avenue, its illuminated facade reflecting in the nearby river. 420 rooms, 3 restaurants with Michelin-starred chefs, and a rooftop lounge that's supposed to have the best view in the city. Elijah leaned forward, absorbing every detail. "What changes are you planning to make?" "That depends on what we find," Marcus replied thoughtfully. "Sometimes the best investments require minimal changes, just better management and vision." The car pulled up to the entrance, where uniformed valets rushed forward to assist with their limited luggage. Marcus had intentionally packed light, bringing only 1 suitcase for the 3 of them, part of their unassuming appearance as ordinary guests rather than the hotel's new owners. Marcus wore dark jeans and a simple navy cashmere sweater, comfortable but quality clothing that reflected his personal style rather than his wealth. He'd left behind his usual custom suits and recognizable accessories, wanting an authentic experience. As they stepped into the opulent lobby with its soaring ceilings and marble floors, Marcus took a moment to observe. He noted the efficiency of the staff, the cleanliness of the space, and, most importantly, how guests were being treated. First impressions were crucial in the hospitality industry, something he'd learned from his earliest days flipping small apartment buildings in Atlanta. "Wow," Zoe whispered, looking up at the massive crystal chandelier dominating the center of the lobby. This place is beautiful. It is, Marcus agreed, squeezing her shoulder gently. Let's see if the service matches the decor. They approached the front desk, where several staff members were assisting other arriving guests. Marcus observed as families were welcomed with warm smiles and efficient service. A white couple to their left was being offered complimentary champagne while checking in, and another family was discussing upgrade options with an attentive manager. Marcus stood in line, his platinum loyalty card in hand. He had been a frequent guest at Meridian Properties over the years and had earned their highest membership tier long before considering the acquisition. His confirmation email showed a reserved executive suite, perfect for the three of them. As they reached the front of the line, the desk attendant smiled briefly before calling over her manager. The manager, a thin man with graying temples and a name tag reading Richard Whitman, general manager, approached with a practiced smile. "Good evening, how may I assist you today?" he asked, his eyes quickly scanning Marcus and his children, lingering momentarily on their modest luggage. Marcus felt a familiar tension in his shoulders, one he'd experienced countless times throughout his career. It was the subtle shift that often occurred when people made assumptions based solely on appearance. Nevertheless, he maintained his professional demeanor, confident in who he was regardless of others' perceptions. "Good evening," Marcus responded with a warm smile. "Checking in for Johnson, reservation for an executive suite for 2 nights." Richard Whitman's smile remained fixed in place as he tapped at his keyboard, though Marcus noticed the manager's eyes flicking between the screen and Marcus's family with a growing look of something akin to concern. The lobby bustled around them, bellhops escorting guests to elevators, the soft piano music nearly drowned by cheerful conversation, the occasional clink of glasses from the adjacent lobby bar. "Johnson. Johnson." Richard muttered, fingers hovering over the keyboard. "I'm afraid I'm not seeing your reservation in our system." Marcus reached for his phone. "I have the confirmation email right here. Reservation number MHG 247859, Executive Suite, 2 nights." He turned the screen toward the manager, displaying the official confirmation from the Meridian Grand. Richard barely glanced at it. "Sometimes our system experiences glitches. Let me check another way." His fingers moved across the keyboard again, deliberately slow. "What was the name once more?" "Marcus Johnson," he replied evenly, sliding his platinum Meridian loyalty card across the marble countertop. "I've been a member of your rewards program for 8 years. Elijah shifted uncomfortably beside his father, exchanging a look with his sister. They'd seen this scenario play out before. Zoe drifted toward a display of Chicago tourist brochures, her way of disengaging from the tension that was quietly building. Richard picked up the loyalty card with 2 fingers, as if it might somehow be counterfeit, and entered the number into his system. His eyebrows raised slightly before his expression smoothed over again. "Ah, I do see a loyalty account, Mr. Johnson. However." He paused, looking past Marcus to where other guests were waiting. "It appears we're fully booked tonight. Despite what you may have received, I'm afraid we don't have any executive suites available." Marcus maintained his calm demeanor. "That's odd, considering I received a confirmation email yesterday and my card has already been charged the deposit." Behind Richard, Marcus could see another desk agent checking in a white family, upgrading them to a better room with effusive smiles about having the perfect suite available. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Perhaps we can recommend another hotel in our network?" Richard suggested, not addressing the charge on Marcus's card. "The Meridian Plaza across town has availability, though it's not quite the caliber of accommodation you were expecting here." The implication hung in the air, that perhaps the Meridian Plaza, in a less prestigious part of town, would be more appropriate for Marcus and his family. "My children and I have had a long day of travel," Marcus said, his voice still pleasant but firm. "I'd prefer to stay at the hotel where I made my reservation, especially since you've already charged my card." Richard's smile became strained. "Like I said, our system shows no available executive suites. We have a standard room with a queen bed, but that would be quite cramped for 3 people. "Dad," Elijah whispered, tugging at his father's sleeve. "We can just go somewhere else." Marcus placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder, squeezing gently. "It's all right, Elijah. I'm sure Mr. Whitman can figure this out for us." He turned back to the manager. "Could you please check again? Perhaps under the Meridian Platinum Rewards program?" Richard sighed, making a show of searching the system again. Mr. Johnson, I understand your frustration, but we are operating at capacity tonight with several VIP guests in-house. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding when you made the reservation. A couple standing in line behind Marcus, both white, both dressed in casual designer clothes, shifted impatiently. Excuse me, the man said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, is there another desk open? We have theater tickets this evening. Richard immediately brightened. Of course, sir. Jennifer can help you at Station 3. He waved over a colleague who had just finished with another guest. They have a confirmed reservation, he added pointedly. Marcus felt his temperature rising but kept his voice level. So do I, Mr. Whitman. Inside, Marcus was calculating his response carefully. He could easily end this charade with a single phone call, revealing his ownership of the entire hotel chain. But years of business negotiations had taught him the value of information asymmetry. Sometimes, you learn the most about people when they didn't know who you were. Zoe had wandered back to his side, her young face showing the familiar weariness of watching her father navigate these situations. Is there a problem with our room? She asked quietly. Before Marcus could answer, Richard interjected. There seems to be some confusion about your father's reservation, young lady. We're trying to sort it out. The condescension in his tone when addressing Zoe made Marcus's patience wear thinner. I'd like to speak with your supervisor, Marcus stated calmly. Richard drew himself up. I am the general manager of this property, sir. There is no supervisor to speak with at this hour. Then perhaps we could discuss this in your office, rather than in the lobby? Marcus suggested, conscious of his children's discomfort with the growing scene. That won't be necessary, Richard replied dismissively. As I've explained, we simply don't have the accommodations you're requesting available. If you'd like, we can call the Meridian Plaza for you, or perhaps. His eyes drifted to Marcus's simple luggage. There's a Holiday Inn about 10 blocks south that might have availability. Elijah's face flushed with anger, but Marcus placed a steadying hand on his son's shoulder. Mr. Whitman, Marcus said, his voice now carrying the quiet authority that had intimidated far more formidable opponents across negotiating tables, I have a confirmed reservation, a charged deposit, and platinum status with your hotel chain. I'm going to give you one more opportunity to check your system properly before this becomes a much larger issue. Richard's expression hardened. Are you threatening me, sir? Not at all, Marcus replied evenly. I'm simply requesting the room I've already paid for. The tension at the front desk had become a quiet spectacle. Nearby guests pretended not to notice while stealing glances at the unfolding situation. A security guard had casually positioned himself within earshot, though Marcus wasn't sure if Richard had summoned him with some unseen signal or if the guard was simply responding to the growing discomfort in the lobby. Mr. Johnson, Richard said, lowering his voice to a tone that managed to be both patronizing and threatening, I understand you believe you have a reservation, but I've checked our system thoroughly. Perhaps there was some confusion on your end? Marcus took a measured breath. There's no confusion on my end, Mr. Whitman. I made this reservation 3 weeks ago. I received a confirmation. My card was charged $837.42 yesterday as the standard deposit for an executive suite. Those are facts, not beliefs. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. Anyone can claim to have a confirmation, sir. And as for the charge, he waved his hand dismissively, if there was one, you can always dispute it with your credit card company. Zoe tugged at her father's sleeve. Dad, can we go somewhere else? Please. The distress in her voice was evident. Marcus looked down at his daughter, seeing the familiar hurt in her eyes. He'd promised himself years ago that he would never let his children see him diminished, never teach them to accept mistreatment. But he'd also promised to show them dignity in the face of prejudice. Sir, the security guard said, approaching them, is there a problem here? Before Marcus could respond, Richard interjected. No problem, James. This gentleman was just leaving. The emphasis on gentleman made it sound like anything but a term of respect. Actually, Marcus replied, keeping his voice steady, we're not leaving until this situation is resolved properly. He turned to the guard. My family has a confirmed reservation for an executive suite. We've been charged a deposit. Mr. Whitman claims no such reservation exists, despite my showing him the confirmation email and my platinum status card. The security guard looked uncertain, glancing between Marcus and the manager. Perhaps you could show your confirmation to James here, Richard suggested with a tight smile. Since you're so certain. Marcus displayed his phone screen to the guard, who reviewed the confirmation email with a frown. This looks legitimate to me, Mr. Whitman, the guard said cautiously. Richard's face tightened with annoyance. James, I've already checked the system. We're at capacity with the medical conference and the orchestral performers. Perhaps this confirmation was cancelled due to overbooking, and Mr. Johnson missed the notification. I've received no cancellation, Marcus stated firmly. And according to your own loyalty program rules, platinum members are guaranteed room availability with 48 hours notice. I made this reservation 3 weeks ago. A small crowd of guests had gathered nearby, some openly watching the confrontation while others pretended to be occupied with their phones or conversations. Marcus noticed a woman filming discreetly from behind a decorative column. Elijah stepped forward, his teenage indignation overcoming his usual reserve. My dad's telling the truth. Why won't you just check us in? Richard's gaze hardened as he looked at Elijah. Young man, the adults are handling this. Don't speak to my son that way, Marcus said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. The security guard shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Whitman, maybe we should double-check. I've checked repeatedly, James, Richard snapped. And frankly, I'm beginning to feel harassed by this situation. He turned back to Marcus. Sir, I've offered alternatives. If those aren't acceptable, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises. Marcus stared at Richard for a long moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Very well. I'd like to record this interaction before we leave, to document that the Meridian Grand refused accommodation to a platinum member with a confirmed reservation. Richard's face flushed. Recording is not permitted in this hotel without management approval. Actually, Marcus replied calmly, Illinois is a one-party consent state for recordings, and your hotel policy, which I reviewed quite thoroughly recently, only prohibits recording in guest rooms and pool areas for privacy reasons. The lobby is a public space. The security guard looked impressed despite himself. He's right about that, sir. Richard's composure began to crack. This is ridiculous. I've been the general manager here for 8 years. I know when someone doesn't belong in my hotel. The words hung in the air, their implication unmistakable. Several nearby guests gasped audibly. And what exactly, Marcus asked with dangerous calm, makes you think my family doesn't belong in this hotel, Mr. Whitman? Richard realized his mistake immediately, backpedaling. That's not, I simply meant that without a valid reservation. My reservation is valid, Marcus interrupted. You simply don't want to honor it. I'd like you to state clearly for the record why that is. The standoff was interrupted by a woman in a tailored suit approaching rapidly from the direction of the offices. Richard, what's going on here? Her name tag identified her as Angela Torres, Assistant General Manager. Richard turned, relief washing over his face. Angela, I was just explaining to this gentleman that we don't have any executive suites available tonight, despite his insistence. Angela glanced at Marcus and his children, then at the growing audience, and the security guard's uncomfortable expression. I just came from reviewing today's arrivals, and we have 3 executive suites still unassigned for tonight. Richard's face went pale. That's impossible. I checked the system myself. Perhaps you were looking at the wrong date, Angela suggested, though her tone made it clear she didn't believe that for a second. She turned to Marcus with a professional smile. I apologize for the confusion, sir. If you'll allow me to assist you, I'd be happy to complete your check-in process. Thank you, Ms. Torres, Marcus replied, maintaining his composure despite the vindication. Richard stepped between them. Angela, we need to discuss this first. There must be some misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding, Angela replied firmly, appears to be your inability to find a confirmed reservation for a platinum member. She looked directly at Marcus. May I see your confirmation, sir? Marcus showed her his phone. Angela nodded after reviewing it. Everything seems in order. If you'll come with me to my station, I'll have you checked in within minutes. "This is outrageous," Richard hissed under his breath. "You're undermining my authority." "We'll discuss this later," Angela replied, her voice low but intense. "Right now, I'm preventing what appears to be a clear case of discrimination against a valued guest." The word discrimination hit Richard like a physical blow. He stepped back, suddenly aware of the many witnesses to the confrontation, several of whom were still recording with their phones. Marcus placed his hands on his children's shoulders. "Lead the way, Ms. Torres. And thank you." As they followed Angela to her desk, Marcus could hear Richard being confronted by several guests who had witnessed the entire exchange. The manager's stammered explanations faded behind them as Angela efficiently processed their check-in. Angela Torres worked with swift efficiency at her computer terminal, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she processed Marcus's check-in. The tension that had filled the lobby just moments ago still lingered in the air, but the focus had shifted away from Marcus and his children. "I sincerely apologize for that experience, Mr. Johnson," Angela said, her voice low enough that only he and his children could hear. "That is not representative of our standard of service." She glanced briefly toward Richard, who was now engaged in an intense conversation with an older couple who appeared to be voicing their disapproval. "I appreciate your intervention, Ms. Torres," Marcus replied, keeping his voice measured. Zoe pressed against his side, her earlier distress slowly giving way to relief. Angela looked up from her screen, her expression professionally neutral but her eyes conveying genuine regret. "Your executive suite is ready, as it has been since this morning. It's one of our corner suites on the 32nd floor with a view of the lake." Elijah, still bristling from the confrontation, crossed his arms. "He said there weren't any rooms available at all." Angela's smile tightened. "There was a misunderstanding." She slid 3 key cards across the counter. "These will give you access to your suite and all executive-level amenities, including the rooftop lounge and spa facilities." A tall man in an impeccably tailored suit approached from the direction of the executive offices. His badge identified him as David Chen, Regional Director. "Ms. Torres," he said quietly, "is everything all right here? One of our guests informed me about a situation in the lobby." Angela straightened. "Mr. Chen, this is Mr. Johnson and his family. They had a confirmed reservation that Mr. Whitman was unable to locate in the system. I'm completing their check-in now." David Chen turned to Marcus, extending his hand. "Mr. Johnson, please accept our deepest apologies for any inconvenience or discomfort you and your family have experienced. This is not how we treat our guests, especially our platinum members." Marcus accepted the handshake, noting the firm grip and the genuine concern in Chen's eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Chen. Ms. Torres has been very helpful in resolving the situation." Chen glanced toward Richard, who was now standing alone near the front desk, his face ashen as he watched the interaction. "I assure you this incident will be addressed immediately. If there's anything we can do to make your stay more comfortable, please don't hesitate to let us know." "Actually," Marcus said, reaching into his pocket for his business card, "I would like to discuss this further, but perhaps tomorrow would be better. My children and I have had a long day of travel." He handed Chen his card, a simple, elegant design with Marcus Johnson, CEO, Johnson Holdings, embossed in silver against a deep blue background. Chen's eyes widened slightly as he recognized the name, though he maintained his professional composure. "Of course, Mr. Johnson. Would 10 a.m. tomorrow be convenient for a meeting?" "Make it 9, Marcus replied. "I'll come to your office." As Angela finished the check-in process, a bellhop appeared to escort them to their suite. Marcus guided his children toward the elevator, aware of Richard's stare following them across the lobby. The whispers had already begun among the staff, information traveling quickly through unseen channels. In the privacy of the elevator, Zoe finally relaxed her grip on her father's arm. "That was awful," she said quietly. Marcus pulled her close. "I'm sorry you had to experience that." Elijah stood tall beside them, his young face serious. "You handled it well, Dad. You didn't lose your temper like that manager did." "There's never an advantage in losing control," Marcus replied, meeting his son's eyes. "Remember that. Dignity and persistence will take you further than anger ever will." As the elevator climbed toward the 32nd floor, Marcus felt his phone vibrate with an incoming text from his assistant Vanessa, "Meeting with Meridian Board confirmed for tomorrow at 2 p.m. All members will be present as requested. Marcus smiled slightly, slipping the phone back into his pocket. Tonight, he would focus on his children and the important task at hand, evaluating his newest acquisition. Tomorrow would bring its reckoning. The Meridian Grand's executive conference room commanded an impressive view of Chicago's skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows that bathed the space in natural morning light. At precisely 9 a.m., Marcus Johnson entered, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that spoke quietly of wealth and position, a stark contrast to his casual attire from the previous evening. David Chen rose immediately to greet him, extending his hand with deferential respect. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson. Thank you for joining us." "Thank you for accommodating my schedule," Marcus replied, surveying the room. Around the polished mahogany table sat Angela Torres, two corporate attorneys from the hotel's legal team, and the hotel's head of security. Conspicuously absent was Richard Whitman. As if reading his mind, Chen gestured to an empty chair. "Mr. Whitman will be joining us shortly. He's been briefed on the development regarding your identity." Marcus nodded, taking his position at the head of the table, a placement that Chen had arranged intentionally. "I trust my children's breakfast in the suite was arranged as requested?" "Yes, sir," Angela confirmed. "Room service delivered it personally, and the hotel's educational liaison is providing a tour of our sustainable operations systems for your son's environmental science project, as you requested." Marcus acknowledged this with a nod of appreciation just as the door opened and Richard Whitman entered. The manager had taken pains with his appearance, fresh haircut, pristine suit, perfect Windsor knot, but nothing could hide the grey pallor of his complexion or the sheen of nervous sweat on his brow. Richard froze momentarily when he saw Marcus seated at the head of the table, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. "Mr. Whitman," Chen said, his tone crisp. "Please join us." Richard moved woodenly to the only remaining seat, directly across from Marcus. "Good morning, Mr. Whitman," Marcus said, his voice pleasantly neutral, the same tone he'd used the previous evening when first approaching the check-in desk. "Mr. Johnson," Richard managed, his voice barely audible. I'd like to express my sincere apologies for last night's misunderstanding." Marcus regarded him silently for a moment, allowing the tension to build. "Before we address that, I'd like to discuss the reason for my visit to Chicago. As I'm sure everyone here is now aware, Johnson Holdings completed its acquisition of the Meridian Hotel Group yesterday afternoon." One of the attorneys shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Our announcement to the public is scheduled for next Monday," Marcus continued, "but I wanted to personally visit several flagship properties before then. An unannounced stay provides valuable insights that formal inspections rarely capture." He opened a leather portfolio and removed several printed pages. "For instance, during my first hour here, I observed 3 separate check-in processes from the lobby seating. The average time for white guests was 4 minutes and 12 seconds. For the 2 Asian families, it was 6 minutes and 20 seconds. My family's attempt took over 15 minutes and was ultimately unsuccessful until Ms. Torres intervened." Richard's face flushed crimson. Marcus continued, his voice remaining even. "While waiting for my meeting with you this morning, I reviewed your customer satisfaction data for the past 6 months. There's a noticeable disparity in satisfaction scores among guests of different backgrounds, particularly in front desk service and upgrade allocations." He passed copies of a graph to everyone at the table. The downward trend for certain demographic groups was unmistakable. "This is deeply concerning," Marcus stated, making eye contact with each person present. "Not just from a moral standpoint, which should be reason enough, but also from a business perspective. The Meridian brand promises exceptional service to all guests. This data suggests we're breaking that promise for specific groups of customers." David Chen leaned forward. "Mr. Johnson, I want to assure you that we take these concerns extremely seriously. Last night's incident has already prompted a review of our training protocols and service standards." "I'm glad to hear that," Marcus replied. "Because addressing this will be our priority under the new ownership." Richard cleared his throat. "Mr. Johnson, if I may, what happened last night was truly an isolated incident. In my 8 years as general manager." "It wasn't isolated," Marcus interrupted calmly. "Your data confirms that." He turned to the head of security. "I understand there's lobby camera footage from last night." The security head nodded. "Yes, sir. We've preserved it as Ms. Torres requested. Excellent. I'd like that footage included in our presentation to the executive board this afternoon. Richard's eyes widened. Executive board? Marcus nodded. Yes, Mr. Whitman. The entire Meridian Executive Board will be joining us at 2 p.m. today to discuss the transition and our new corporate priorities. Your incident will serve as a case study for the changes we need to implement. The color drained from Richard's face. Mr. Johnson, please, I have a family to support. 20 years in this industry. Marcus held up his hand. Mr. Whitman, I haven't said anything about your employment status. At Johnson Holdings, we believe in accountability and growth, not just punishment. What I'm interested in now is whether you recognize the problem and are committed to being part of the solution. The room fell silent. Angela Torres was watching Richard intently, as was everyone else at the table. Richard's shoulders sagged as the fight visibly left him. It was wrong, he admitted quietly. What I did last night, the assumptions I made, they were wrong. And he swallowed hard, not isolated, as you said. Marcus nodded, acknowledging the difficult admission. Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Whitman. That's where change begins. He turned to Chen. I'd like Mr. Whitman to prepare a presentation for this afternoon's meeting, an honest assessment of guest experience disparities at this property and his recommendations for addressing them. Chen looked surprised but nodded. Of course, Mr. Johnson. You have 4 hours, Mr. Whitman, Marcus said, turning back to the manager. I suggest you collaborate with Ms. Torres, who seems to have a better grasp of our service standards. This is your opportunity to demonstrate whether you belong in the Meridian Group's future. Richard's expression shifted from fear to confused gratitude. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Marcus stood, signaling the end of the meeting. My children and I will be conducting an informal inspection of the property this morning. Mr. Chen, I'd like you to join me. Ms. Torres, please assist Mr. Whitman with his presentation. As everyone gathered their materials, Marcus paused by Richard's chair. My son will be attending Northwestern next fall, he said quietly. We'll be regular guests at this hotel. I expect he'll never again have to question whether he belongs here. Richard looked up, meeting Marcus's gaze directly for the first time. No, sir. He won't. I give you my word. Marcus nodded once, then turned to leave, the dynamic of power and respect fundamentally and irreversibly transformed. The Meridian Group's executive boardroom buzzed with nervous energy as 13 board members arranged themselves around the massive conference table. Most had flown in on short notice after receiving David Chen's urgent summons. None fully understood why the new owner, a man whose acquisition of their company had been finalized just 2 days prior, had demanded their immediate presence in Chicago. Marcus sat at the head of the table, reviewing notes on his tablet as the executives settled in. His children were enjoying the hotel's pool under the watchful eye of Vanessa, having extracted a promise from their father that they would all have dinner together regardless of how long this meeting ran. At precisely 2 p.m., Marcus stood, commanding immediate silence. Good afternoon, he began. Thank you all for adjusting your schedules. I know this meeting was unexpected, but after my first night as a guest in one of our flagship properties, I realized we couldn't delay this conversation. Confusion flickered across several faces at his use of power, a subtle reminder that ownership had changed. For those I haven't met yet, I'm Marcus Johnson, CEO of Johnson Holdings and as of Tuesday, the new owner of the Meridian Hotel Group. He gestured to Richard Whitman, who sat rigidly near the middle of the table, his presentation materials arranged precisely before him. This is Richard Whitman, General Manager of the Chicago property. Last night, my children and I attempted to check into this hotel with a confirmed reservation. Mr. Whitman will now share what transpired. Richard stood, visibly tense but composed. The tremor in his hands was barely noticeable as he distributed materials to the board members. Last night, he began, his voice steady despite his obvious discomfort, I refused accommodation to Mr. Johnson and his family despite their confirmed reservation and platinum status. I claimed we were fully booked when we weren't. I suggested they try a different hotel, one in a less prestigious neighborhood. A murmur ran through the room as board members exchanged glances. I did this, Richard continued, while simultaneously upgrading other guests who arrived after them. The difference was that those guests were white, and Mr. Johnson's family is black. The blunt admission silenced the room. Richard clicked to display the lobby security footage. The board watched in uncomfortable silence as the scene unfolded, Marcus's calm persistence, Richard's growing hostility, and the eventual intervention by Angela Torres. When the video ended, Richard continued. This wasn't an isolated incident. As you can see in the data before you, we have a pattern of service discrepancies based on guests' perceived backgrounds. He methodically walked the board through the customer satisfaction disparities that Marcus had highlighted earlier, adding his observations about unconscious biases in room assignments, upgrade distributions, and complaint resolutions. These numbers represent real people having inferior experiences in our hotels, Richard concluded. People who paid the same rates but received less value. People who entrusted their comfort to us and were betrayed by that trust. People like our new owner, who I failed to recognize not just as a VIP but as a human being deserving of basic respect. He resumed his seat, the silence in the room heavy with collective discomfort. Marcus stood again. Thank you, Mr. Whitman, for your honesty and thorough analysis. He surveyed the faces around the table. I suspect some of you are wondering if this meeting is about making an example of Mr. Whitman, or perhaps about signaling some dramatic change in corporate culture. It's about something more fundamental. Marcus clicked to a new slide showing the Meridian Hotel's mission statement, extraordinary service for every guest, every time. This is your promise, Marcus said. Our promise now. But as Mr. Whitman's data demonstrates, it's a promise we're breaking for specific groups of customers. That stops today. For the next hour, Marcus outlined a comprehensive plan, mandatory bias training for all customer-facing staff, mystery shopper programs specifically designed to test for service consistency across diverse guests, revised performance metrics that included equity measurements, and a new executive position focused on inclusive hospitality. Implementation begins immediately at all properties, Marcus concluded. Mr. Chen will oversee the rollout, with quarterly progress reports directly to me. This isn't about politics or public relations, it's about delivering on our core promise to every guest who chooses our hotels. He paused, looking around the table. Are there any questions? One of the board members, an older man with silver hair, leaned forward. What about Mr. Whitman's position? Given the circumstances. Marcus nodded, acknowledging the unspoken question. Mr. Whitman made a serious error in judgment that reflected poorly on our brand. He also demonstrated remarkable courage today in owning that mistake without excuses. He turned to Richard. In my company, we value accountability and growth. You'll remain as general manager under a 6-month probationary period, during which you'll lead the implementation of these new protocols at this property. Your success will be measured not just by financial metrics but by demonstrable improvement in equitable service delivery. Relief washed over Richard's face. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I won't let you down. This isn't about me, Marcus replied. It's about every guest who walks through our doors. As the meeting concluded and board members filed out, Richard approached Marcus. Mr. Johnson, he said quietly, I know an apology isn't enough, but I am truly sorry for how I treated you and your children. Marcus studied him thoughtfully. Your actions hurt my children, Mr. Whitman. They've had to learn too young that some people will see their skin before seeing them. What matters now is what you do with this experience. I understand, Richard nodded. May I ask, why give me this chance? You could easily have fired me, made an example of me. Examples come and go, Marcus replied. Systemic change requires converting those within the system. You know this hotel better than anyone. Now you also know its flaws. That makes you uniquely positioned to fix them, if you're willing. Richard straightened his shoulders. I am. I'll make this right. Good, Marcus said. Because this isn't just about business. My son asked me last night why that man at the desk seemed to hate us without knowing us. I want him to see that people can learn and change. That justice sometimes looks like transformation, not just punishment. As Marcus turned to leave, Richard called after him. Your children, they seem remarkable. Marcus smiled, his first genuine smile in Richard's presence. They are. And the next time you see them, I hope they'll be welcomed as the extraordinary guests they are. Richard nodded solemnly. They will be. Everyone will be. 3 months later, Marcus Johnson returned to the Chicago Meridian Grand, this time for the official unveiling of the hotel's renovated lobby and new training center. The transformation of the physical space, while impressive, was secondary to the operational changes that had taken root throughout the Meridian Group. As his car pulled up to the entrance, Marcus noticed Richard Whitman standing at attention with the welcome team, his posture professional but no longer stiff with the arrogance that had characterized their first encounter. "Mr. Johnson," Richard greeted him with a genuine smile, "welcome back to the Meridian Grand. Your timing is perfect, the final touches on the training center were completed this morning." Marcus shook his hand. "Glad to hear it. How are the new protocols working?" "Transformative," Richard replied, falling into step beside Marcus as they entered the lobby. "Our guest satisfaction scores are up across all demographics, and our staff retention has improved by 23% since implementation." The lobby hummed with efficient activity, staff members moving with purpose while maintaining genuine warmth in their guest interactions. Marcus noted that the team was noticeably more diverse than during his first visit. "Your executive suite is ready," Richard continued, "though I should mention that your son's requested materials for his college project have been arranged in the conference room as he specified." Marcus smiled. "Elijah will be pleased. His freshman orientation at Northwestern is tomorrow, but he's determined to complete this research project before classes begin." They reached the elevator, where Angela Torres was waiting to accompany them upstairs. She'd been promoted to Director of Guest Experience for the entire Midwest region, part of the restructuring Marcus had initiated. As the elevator doors closed, Richard's professional demeanor softened slightly. "Mr. Johnson, I've been hoping for an opportunity to speak with you privately." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Is something wrong?" "Not at all," Richard assured him. "Quite the opposite. I wanted to thank you personally. These past months have been educational, to say the least." The elevator opened on the executive floor, and they walked toward the newly established training center, its glass doors etched with the words, "Every guest, every time, excellence through equity." "The training program you suggested, the one where executives experience check-in as guests from different backgrounds, that was particularly eye-opening," Richard continued. "I never understood how exhausting it is to constantly wonder if you're being treated differently because of how you look." They paused outside the training center doors. Inside, a diverse group of staff members was engaged in a role-playing exercise led by a facilitator. "It's not about guilt or shame," Marcus observed. "It's about awareness and choice. We all have biases, the question is whether we recognize them and choose to act differently." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "My daughter asked me recently why I seemed different, less stressed despite working longer hours. I told her I'd learned something important, that treating people equally isn't just the right thing to do, it's also good business." Marcus smiled. "Smart observation." A comfortable silence fell between them, the kind that would have been impossible during their first encounter. "There's something else," Richard said finally. "The mentor you assigned to me, Mr. Washington from your Atlanta property, he shared something that's stayed with me." "What was that?" "He said that true leadership isn't about never making mistakes. It's about having the courage to acknowledge them and the commitment to grow from them." Richard met Marcus's gaze directly. "I want you to know that lesson has changed not just how I manage this hotel, but how I live my life." Marcus extended his hand. "That's the best outcome I could have hoped for, Richard." As they shook hands, Marcus caught sight of his reflection in the glass doors, standing shoulder to shoulder with a man who had once dismissed him and his children as unworthy of basic respect. Not as adversaries, but as partners in progress. "The renovation looks remarkable," Marcus said, gesturing toward the training center. "But the real transformation has been in the culture. That's something to be proud of." Richard nodded, his expression reflective. "You could have fired me that day. Most would have. Instead, you challenged me to be better." "Sometimes justice isn't about punishment," Marcus replied, echoing what he'd told Richard months earlier. "Sometimes it's about creating the change you want to see." As they entered the training center together, Marcus thought of his children, of the world he was working to build for them, one hotel, one interaction, one changed mind at a time. It wasn't a perfect world yet, but it was moving in the right direction, one conversation, one revelation at a time. The next morning, as Elijah moved into his Northwestern dorm room, he found an unexpected package waiting for him. Inside was a leather portfolio embossed with the Johnson Holdings logo and a handwritten note from Richard Whitman, for the future business leader who taught me my most important lesson in hospitality: everyone deserves to be welcomed. Your father changed our hotel. You changed my perspective. Sometimes, respect isn't given freely, it must be earned or even demanded. But when the tables turn, the lesson resonates far beyond one encounter. Did this story resonate with you? Subscribe to Tables Turn for more powerful narratives that remind us all: respect is universal, judgment is optional, and karma keeps receipts. Share your thoughts in the comments below and tell us about a time when you witnessed or experienced an unexpected reversal of fortune. Remember, you never truly know someone's story, power, or potential until the moment the tables are turned. Raised fist, medium dark skin tone.